Allied attacks, September 1941. The Allies were able to use the natural strategic positioning of Malta as a base to launch offensive operations. With the control of Malta back in British hands, the Allied powers were able to calculate operations and deploy them when they wanted to. Multiple naval victories caused the destruction of hundreds of Axis ships and convoys, 108 of those coming in between June and September via the Royal Navy submarines, RAF and FAA. In September alone, Axis forces lost 31,608 tons of supplies. These defeats only continued when the Axis operations with the RAF were so successful that in November 1941, the fuel losses amassed to 49,365 tons out of their supply of 79,208 tons. Despite the Luftwaffe being away from Malta until December, Italian bombing runs were proving successful. Before the Luftwaffe returned, the RAF reported they had shot down 199 Italian aircrafts, whilst the RAF only received 94 casualties in air conflicts. Luftwaffe returns, December 1941 to August 1942. By June 1941, a German general named Geisler had been moved to Libya to assist the DAK in the North Africa campaign. In the Mediterranean, the Allies recovered and began offensive operations against Axis, bringing supplies in the DAK in North Africa. These supply losses heavily affected Geisler's ability to support Erwin Rommel in his conquest of Africa, which created tension amongst the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe. To solve this issue, the German High Command decided on Geisler returning to Sicily with his remaining air force. The return of the Luftwaffe in the Mediterranean saw the temporary elimination of the British Air Force, destroying multiple RAF bombers and reconnaissance aircraft, also securing the safety of shipping throughout the Mediterranean once again. Pressure was applied to the RAF at rates compared to the fight for France. Out of 340 fighters that were involved in the Malta air conflicts, only 28 managed to remain. 263 raids were conducted by the Axis in January of 1942, an increase of 94 compared to December. The primary objective of these strikes was to cripple the airfields and weaken the supply of the RAF. Meanwhile, the RAF was complaining to the British High Command about the efficiency of the Hurricanes and instead argued for the Spitfires, which weren't as inferior to the Germans as the Hurricanes were. The Axis plan of invasion, April 1942. After 2 years of brutal warfare, a plan for the invasion of Malta was finally approved by Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. The plan consisted of an airborne assault with 2 single German and Italian divisions under the command of the Luftwaffe General Kurt Student, whilst a small seaborne operation would attempt to break into Malta with the escort of the Italian Navy called the Regia Marina. During careful thought between Germany and Italy, it was decided that the invasion of Malta would take full priority in the region. Despite the recent success and in-depth planning, the invasion never went through, and it was Adolf Hitler that didn't want to pull the trigger. This was because of multiple reasons, the primary being Erwin Rommel. Rommel had secured North Africa, and even though he himself agreed on the invasion of Malta, he believed Egypt and the Suez Canal should be taken first. The secondary reason for calling the operation off was because of Hitler himself. After dwelling on the Battle of Crete in May to June 1941, he deemed the use of paratroopers as too risky, since the losses of that campaign were too high and put stress on the German generals. Instead, Hitler suggested that if the Wehrmacht reached the Egyptian borders, then it would open up for an invasion of Malta in August 1942. This obviously frustrated a German general called Kesselring, as the German army had only reached as far as Libya at the time, but he was relieved that the operation wasn't completely called off. RAF Revival, February to May 1942. Desperation started to sink in for the RAF and British High Command. Before the new Spitfires would arrive to the Mediterranean, many other ideas were raised to reduce losses and regain air superiority. One of these plans was raised by Hugh Lloyd, a British general. He brought the introduction of the loose finger four formation in an attempt to cut RAF losses by creating more varied tactics to compensate for technical inferiority. Not only did the continuous Axis bombardments cripple Malta's air capabilities, but also their naval. Air superiority enabled the Germans to destroy British submarines and harbors. The plan Hitler had envisioned was going just the way he thought, neutralizing Malta via siege. 6,557 tons worth of bombs were dropped on Malta between the 20th of March and 28th of April 1942, only losing 173 aircrafts in the process. Supply was also stabilized in North Africa, successfully delivering 150,389 tons of supplies in April out of the 150,578 that were dispatched. However, this was subject to change as on the 9th of May, 64 Spitfires arrived at Malta, and the air victories were immediately building up for Britain, with the Italians revealing 37 Axis losses on the same day the Spitfires arrived. The next day, 65 losses, and with Malta now having 5 full squadrons of Spitfires, the RAF had the confidence to deal with any Axis aerial threat. There were still issues for Malta, seeing the shortages of food, water, and clothing, which ultimately led to the people of Malta suffering from starvation and poor rates of sanitation with the ever-growing risk of disease. The British Army wasn't excluded from this either. Rations were being reduced daily from 4 to 2,000 calories. German convoy success. With the RAF regaining air superiority over the island, the German pressure enabled Axis convoys to resupply the Wehrmacht in Africa, and with the Luftwaffe relieving themselves of primary involvement in aerial conflicts above Malta, they could now assist Erwin Rommel's advance in North Africa. After winning the Battle of Gazala, Rommel very much had a foothold in Egypt and continued to press El Alamein. The Royal Navy attempted to reassure Malta, launching Operation Harpoon and Operation Vigorous with 2 separate convoys. There was hope the Axis would be distracted and thus let one convoy slip through the blockade. Both operations failed. Harpoon lost a large part of their fleet, losing the HMS Bedouin, 3 merchants, and a tanker via Italian cruisers. Vigorous was forced to turn around after being defeated in many naval and air conflicts. Allied victory, July to November 1942. July saw the replacement of Hugh Floyd with Keith Park for the command of the RAF on Malta. The reasoning for this was that Park had already faced the generals commanding the German Air Force in the Battle of Britain and beaten them. Park had advocated sending small numbers of fighters into battle to meet the enemy. There were 3 fundamental reasons for this. First, there would always be fighters in the air covering those on the ground if one did not send their entire force to engage at once. Second, small numbers were quicker to position and easier to move around. Third, the preservation of his force was critical. The fewer fighters he had in the air, the smaller target the numerically superior enemy would have. Over Malta, he reversed these tactics owing to changed circumstances. With an abundance of Spitfires to operate, Park sought to intercept the enemy and break up his formations before the bombers reached the island. Until this point, the Spitfires had fought defensively. They scrambled and headed south to gain height, then turned around to engage the enemy over the island. After improved radars, technologies, and more of Park's genius, the Allies were able to secure the skies enough to suggest an invasion. A key part of the plan was to cripple German and Italian passage through the Mediterranean and landlock them to Europe. It is estimated that British submarines had sunk 650,000 tons of ships alone, with another 400,000 tons of damaged vessels. The plan of landlocking Germany was going to plan as Rommel's forces were being starved in Africa, and thus their position was absolutely critical. The situation was worsening for Rommel since the Brits were reinforcing their already existing lines. In desperation, the German general berated the need of fuel and ammunition to the high command of the Wehrmacht. Action was taken via an organized convoy just shy of El Alamein, according to the Second Battle of El Alamein. However, this didn't go to plan, and the message was intercepted by the Allies, and 8 of the 9 ships sent were destroyed. Rommel didn't have time to wait for the 3,198 tons of fuel that was on board of the last tanker. the San Andreas, and despite needing the fuel, he engaged the Brits at El Alamein. These weren't the only issues he was facing. A brutal disease due to lack of food and water reached 10% of the Axis soldiers, and with morale hitting an all-time low, this was a recipe for catastrophic loss on behalf of Germany. Following his defeat in the Second Battle of El Alamein, on the 1st of September 1942, Erwin Rommel had no choice but to cut his losses and was forced to retreat. A similar scenario occurred towards the end of October, which saw Rommel lose 44% of his supplies, an increase from the 20% lost in September. The Axis defeat in Egypt would prove to be crucial for the security of Malta. Malta's strike forces played a very important role in the stagnation of the Axis's progress into Egypt, eliminating 33% of Axis supplies and 41% of fuel. On the 16th of October, Albert Kesselring called off the Axis invasion of Malta, marking the last official offensive over the island at the hands of the Luftwaffe, which continued the devastating bombing runs that were executed earlier in the conflict. Despite the Luftwaffe still seeing success, there wasn't any hope of a significant breakthrough, and it was thought that there would be more luck in Africa. What happened after the Battle of Malta, and what did it mean for both sides? The Axis took the brunt of the losses, leaving the Luftwaffe in a bad state, and because of this lacked air support in other battles. Victory over Malta wasn't the last that the Allies would see. Britain had broken through German defenses at El Alamein, and Allied landings were also reported in Morocco and Algeria on the 8th of November. Confirmation of safety for the people of Malta came on the 20th of November when a convoy reached the island unscathed. This was seen again on the 6th of December under a convoy called Operation Portcullis. Success in Africa enabled the Allies to control more airfields and provide air support whilst delivering supplies to Malta and other territories. Thank you for watching this Everything History video. We hope you learned something or at least enjoy the spectacle of the Battle of Malta. What other videos would you like to see in the future? Let us know in the comments below.